Good evening, everyone, as you're joining us. And gosh, we've got people coming in thick and fast, so we'll just let people join. So we'll just take a couple of minutes, but welcome again. It's always a pleasure to see you all at the Society of Church Archaeology monthly lectures. And I know I can already recognize some familiar names. So we have lots of regular followers, but I'm sure some of you may be joining us for the first time. And I know that you join us from all around the world, which is amazing. And it always makes us feel very humble to see how far away you are. I'm not going to start the usual who's the furthest from where we are competition, but we normally have people from Canada, Australia, as well as all over Europe. As well as here in the UK. So as you're still joining in, that's great. While we're waiting for people to join, I'll just remind you, I'm sure you're all so familiar with how these things work with us, but also everyone else who uses Zoom. Once I've introduced our speaker, she'll start presenting, which is fantastic. And I'm sure you'll be full of inquisitive, penetrating, probing questions. So just type them into the chat box. And then at the end, Rob will collate those questions and put them to our speaker. Because it also shows what an insightful lot you all are, is that we often have very, very similar questions coming in from multiple different people who are picking up on pertinent points. So Rob will field them and condense them. And present them at the end. I'll just introduce our speaker tonight, who is Dr. Meg Bernstein, who is a Fulbright scholar. Now, for those of you who don't know about Fulbright scholars, it means they're very intelligent. Fulbright scholarships are, extremely competitive. And she's a scholar in, in the history of art at the University of York. But she was formerly of the parish of the University of California in Los Angeles. We've had our first person chiming in that they're from Great Waltham in Essex. So fantastic. Hopefully it's lovely down in Essex. She completed a PhD in 2019 on medieval art and architecture. And she's got a current book project, which I haven't asked her about. But I presume, I don't know if that's imminent, but she's working hard on a book on a living church building the English parish church between 1150 and 1300. So I suspect that may or may not feed it a little bit into tonight's talk. Anyway, without any further ado, because I think we've got most people connected in, Dr. Meg is going to be talking tonight on the I know it's a very exciting topic of visualizing purgatory in the medieval English church. So I will hand over to her and she can tell us all about it.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Hugh, and thank you, Rob, for the invitation to be here. It's an absolute delight to be here with you all. So, some of the most familiar images in medieval art are those that depict the sharp dichotomy between heaven and hell. For example, the very famous Last Judgment tympanum de Saint-Foy in Conques on the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela is very easily legible. Christ is seated at center in judgment, and to his right, queuing decorously behind the Virgin Mary and St. Peter, are those about to be saved. The narrative continues beneath them, where the saved are welcomed into heaven via a rounded portal. And the saved sit erect and confronting in arches and arcades. And on Christ's left, our right, things are very different. Rather than the pleasant, peaceful, and orderly scene in heaven, writhing bodies and fearsome devils populate hell, enacting gruesome torments on the damned. On the conch tympanum, you're either in or you're out, you're saved or you're damned. There's no ambiguity, and the conditions in the two places are starkly different. This dichotomy, representing the prevailing theological understanding of the afterlife for most medieval Christians until at least the middle of the 12th century, is what's represented here. Yet even before that, there was some belief that there's an intermediary period in the afterlife that caused prayers for a person's soul to be efficacious. This is evident in the writings of the Church Fathers, like Cyril of Jerusalem, who in the 4th century described that in the Mass, we make mention also of those who have already fallen asleep. First, the patriarchs, prophets, apostles, and martyrs, that through their prayers and supplications, God would receive our petition. Next, we make mention also of the Holy Fathers and bishops who have already fallen asleep. And to put it simply, all among us who have already fallen asleep. For we believe that it will be a very great benefit to the souls of those for whom the petition is carried up while this holy and most solemn sacrifice is laid out. Yet, those early statements from the Church Fathers are not very specific about the wheres, the whats, and the hows of the place where these sleeping souls that we're hearing about rest. In The Birth of Purgatory, Jacques Le Goff showed that although the idea of an intermediary realm distinct from heaven and hell was not new in the 12th century, only in the second half of the 12th century did purgatory as such come to be discussed as a specific place and entity. As Le Goff shows, for example, in the Summa on Ecclesiastical Offices from about 1165, Jean Beleth, a canon of Notre Dame in Paris, wrote that while some souls were believed to go directly to heaven and hell, there are others in the middle for which a recommendation of this sort must be made. One of Peter Commester's 1160-70 sermons on the dedication of a church uses the phrase in purgatorio, showing that the concept was in use by then, by about 1170. So although it was not formalized by the Catholic Church until the Second Council of Lyon in 1274, the concept was already in strong circulation a century earlier. It's difficult to overstate how critical the introduction of purgatory was within the Latin Church from the 13th century onward. It precipitated the economy of chantry masses, coupled with, in some cases, extravagant chantry chapels, like these two examples, one in a parish church and one at sort of cathedral level. It also led to the production of indulgences, which would become one of the complaints of Protestant reformers a couple centuries after. Yet, in spite of the undeniable prevalence of purgatory in the lives and deaths of medieval Christians from the 12th century forward, it's been observed that in the Middle Ages, there was a representational silence in the depiction of purgatory, at least in the century or two after that Second Council of Lyon, with the possible exception of in Italy, where Dante's Divine Comedy inspires some visual representations of purgatory, albeit in a very specific literary context. As Robert Mills has shown, there is a corpus of later medieval images in various media depicting purgatory, like this extraordinary Carthusian manuscript where purgatory is pretty clearly labeled here. Yet in general, these images are from the 15th century, not in the decades when the doctrine of purgatory was reaching fever pitch in interest, particularly from lay people. The main focus of my talk today will take us to the Church of St. Peter and Paul of Chalden, which occupies a quiet part of Surrey. Although it's a little less than 16 miles from Charing Cross, the village feels a world away from London. There's a church recorded in this small settlement in Domesday Book, at which time it was held by Rolf Fitzgerald in the land of Otto of Bayeux. And while there's evidence that Chertsey Abbey held land in Chalden in the centuries before the conquest, there isn't any evidence that I'm aware of that the abbey that the church was under monastic patronage either at the time of the conquest or in the 12th century. The church is small, and from its exterior, it's rather unassuming. Yet, in 1870, Chalden was the site of a rather remarkable discovery. During building work, Reverend H. Shepherd spotted signs of a painting when whitewash was disturbed, both locating a previously unknown mural and causing it to be saved. E.V. Austin, Secretary of the Surrey Archaeological Society, seems to be responsible for the painting's restoration at the time of its discovery. It was again restored in 1989 when a coating of wax applied with protective intentions was deemed harmful and removed. Sorry. The discovery of medieval wall paintings in the 19th century is not in and of itself unusual. Medieval churches were widely covered with wall paintings, which were lime-washed by the brushes of iconoclastic reformers under Edward VI. What is remarkable about the Chalden discovery is its subject matter and unusual iconography, which has been the subject of debate in a handful of articles since its discovery in 1870. While most authors have focused on formal accounts and debates over the iconography, my aim diverges slightly. Excuse me. I'm interested in the iconography of the painting insofar as it relates to expanding our knowledge of lay piety and the architecture of the parish church, and how this fits within the nascent understanding of purgatory. Pardon me. The mural is located on the western wall of the nave of the church. In the Middle Ages, Chalden was formed of only nave and chancel with no tower. At the time of Domesday Book, it was likely a double cell plan with no aisles. And around the time of the painting in the last quarter of the 12th century, it gained aisles, which is quite typical of the building type in this period. I'll return shortly to the architecture of the church after a discussion of the painting's iconography. Sorry about the coughing. Based on style, the mural has been dated around 1170 or 1200. There are other surviving wall paintings in the southeast from the 12th century, including Whitley, also in Surrey, and the so-called Lewes group composed of Clayton, Coombs, Hardham, Plimpton, and Westmaston in Sussex, thought to have been executed by a traveling group of painters, perhaps associated with the Cluniac Priory at Lewes nearby. Chalden's mural, though, doesn't seem to fit stylistically with any of these other examples in the region. But the issue of survival, seems to be a potential cause of not being able to link it with anything similar. So while Chalden's parishioners face the altar in the chancel, an arresting scene plays out behind their backs, nestled between the arcade responds, separating the naves from side aisles. The composition is composed of two main registers, which are connected by a vertical passage, a ladder that reaches from the bottom of the composition to the top, where Christ appears nimmed and bust length in a roundel situated among a wavy cloud-like puff. The bottom register is somewhat unambiguously represents hell. On the left of the ladder, two bird-footed devils cook souls in a cauldron raised over violent flames. On the right, a second pair of devils elevate a spiky, upside-down crosscut saw, where souls seemingly continue to perform their trades from life under what Tristram has called insuperable difficulties. We have a potter who attempts to shape a pot, a woman spinning yarn without a distaff, and two blacksmiths attempting to make a horseshoe without an anvil. And I'm thinking the second woman is also, again, attempting to spin without a distaff. The figures here are quite precariously perched. They're neither sitting nor standing on this torturous device. The saw blade forms a visual opposite with the ladder at the center of the painting. Unlike the ladder, where vertical movement is possible, the saw blade bridge offers no end to suffering because the destination on either end is the mouth of a devil. The saw is a somewhat ambiguous object. Like the cauldron, it's an object of daily life, used in quite banal ways, shown here being worked by two carpenters in a detail from the Smithfield decretals executed about in the 1340s. Yet a crosscut saw is also found in much more sinister contexts, like the martyrdom scene on this Catalonian altar frontal, showing St. Quiricus suffering during his passion, or the martyrdom of the prophet Isaiah. This altar frontal, which is a near contemporary of the Chalden painting, also coincidentally shows a cauldron as an instrument of torture, like the hell scene at Chalden. If the cauldron and saw bridge are the main scenes of the bottom register, they're surrounded by a number of smaller vignettes representing a diverse range of torments. On the far right of the composition, a leafy fruit tree flourishes in spite of the heat of the nearby fire. This can surely be identified as a tree of knowledge. You can probably see that there's a serpent here, winding his way through its upper branches, with his head facing to the north arcade, his face now lost. In contemporary representations of Adam and Eve in the garden, like this one in Marigny in France, the serpent also faces right towards Eve. Interestingly, although Adam and Eve are not present within the tree in the lower register of the Chalden painting, we might see them elsewhere. The upper register is iconographically more ambiguous than the lower one. At the left, St. Michael weighs souls, interrupted by a meddling claw-footed devil who cheats the scales by adding a weight in his hand. Moving to the right, two angels surround the central ladder, and on their right, Christ stands on the legs of a recumbent devil with bound hands and sticks his staff into his mouth. And here we have small naked souls with their hands raised, facing towards Christ for salvation. This has been identified as a Herald of Hell, where Christ descends into the underworld in the days before his death and resurrection to rescue souls trapped there. So if the lower register represents hell, the upper register doesn't unambiguously represent heaven. Instead, the scenes here reflect the deciding moments between the two, where the soul is weighed and where souls are pulled out of hell. The latter is both the formal and the functional center of the image. It's the most unusual element of iconography depicted at Chalden, and it forms the visual link between each of the zones, including the named Christ, who is the goal that the climbers aim to reach at the top. The ladder itself is proportionally large, and the distance between each rung seems monumental, given the size of the souls climbing it. The closer the climbers are to reaching Christ, the more capable they appear. The ones at the top of the ladder stand erect and seem to be able to pull themselves up and also reach for their salvation. They're more evenly spaced and there are fewer of them. Alternatively, the souls in the bottom half of the ladder clumsily fall, some of them toppling headlong to the ground to be tormented in hell or to perhaps attempt their journey again. I want to digress for a moment to consider the issue of typology as it relates to the Chalden painting. This mural has often been included within the category of Last Judgment or doom paintings. And in fact, any Google search for doom painting will mainly turn up a lot of images of this Chalden painting. Doom refers to the last or great judgment at the end of the world. And according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the first known usage of doom in this context occurs in the Trinity College homilies of about 1200. There is no rigid typology of doom paintings before the 14th century, when Roger Rosewell notes that they've evolved into an increasingly predictable two-tier scheme, usually painted on the east nave wall above the chancel arch. In this late 15th century example from St. Thomas in Salisbury, this is a sort of typified version of these doom paintings. Christ sits in judgment over the chancel arch, his wounds still bloody. He's surrounded by angels holding the instruments of his passion and framed by the Virgin and John the Evangelist. Beneath him, the 12 apostles are seated, and on the spandrels, we see the dead rising out of their tombs. On the north side, angels guide them into heaven, depicted as a contemporary castle. And on the south, the damned are processed into the mouth of hell. Prior to the 14th century, there's no one way to represent the end of days. Examples of this include perhaps the earliest one from Houghton on the Hill, where a trumpeting angel summons the dead for judgment. And the equestrian devil at Clayton drags the hair of one of the damned. But I prefer to be cautious in classifying these paintings, which approach subjects related to the end of days, but that do not depict Christ in judgment as dooms. Although some of the typical acts of judgment take place in Chalden's painting, such as the weighing of souls, it's not the final judgment with Christ arbitrating on his heavenly throne. Instead, the central zone is occupied by the ladder which souls climb. Christ waits in his heavenly cloud for them, but does not appear to be judging. The ladder is the trial of ordeal for the souls. If they manage to climb it, they're welcome to heaven. The issue at hand seems to be one of agency, to which I will later return. It would be beneficial to consider the iconographical elements in the composition within a broader context. I'll start with the bottom register. Tristram has explained these smaller vignettes that surround the two main scenes as illustrations of the 7 deadly sins, another attempt towards typology, which the Chalden painting resists. The 7 deadly sins are often depicted in English medieval wall painting, and it's logical that as there are precisely 7 small compositions, it would represent them. However, it is worth querying this logic. Most surviving examples of the 7 deadly sins in wall paintings are from quite a lot later than the Chalden mural in the 14th or 15th centuries. While the 7 deadly sins are described by Gregory the Great in his 6th century Moralian Job, it wasn't until Lateran IV in 1215 that the church began overtly to be concerned with ensuring that parishioners were aware of them. This has to do with the sacrament of confession, which was established as a requisite annual practice in 1215. Venial sins could be forgiven without confession. So-called deadly sins needed to be confessed to the parish priest. The location of murals featuring these sins on the walls of parish churches thus serve as a reminder both not to sin, but also what to confess when sin has been committed. Perhaps if the painter or iconographer behind the Chalden mural was learned, as many commentators have suggested, he would have been familiar with the 7 deadly sins. However, it's very unlikely that he would have been prepared to depict them visually. Instead, what seems more plausible is that the painter depicted a variety of torments in the available space, which coincidentally number 7. It's not surprising to find a Herald of Hell image at Chalden. In England, a Herald of Hell was well known from Anglo-Saxon poetry and sermons. At Chalden, a standing Christ is shown plunging his staff into the mouth of the recumbent devil to induce vomit to release souls. And perhaps the most well-known Herald of Hell in England is the Lincoln West Front frieze, where a massive yawping mouth of hell is laid on its side from which Christ is pulling souls. It's also the subject on a number of baptismal fonts, like a surviving example at Erdesley, as well as a number in Sweden and on the continent. Baptism offers salvation, a means to escape hell, much like the harrowing. On the Erdesley font, Christ rescues one figure, identified as Adam, to stand in for perhaps a larger group. No hell mouth or devil is present, but swirling lines, then a lion-like creature follow Adam, the devil apparently swapped for another fearsome beast. 11th and 12th century manuscript illuminations, like in the Tiberius and Winchester Psalters, make creative use of the devil's mouth as a frightening entrance to heaven. As the Winchester Psalter shows, the first 2 people taken from hell in most examples of this iconography are Adam and Eve. Given the location of the Chalden harrowing, just above the serpent in a tree, there is perhaps an implication that Adam and Eve were once there, but have progressed in God's timeline. Most similar to the Chalden depiction, and perhaps closest in terms of its parochial context, I think is the north doorway tympanum at Quennington, where the entire body of the devil is shown. The presence of the tympanum, the harrowing on a tympanum, particularly on the north, more sinister side, seems to take on a kind of prophylactic quality for those entering the church at Quennington. Iconographically, the most unusual part of the composition at Chalden is, of course, this ladder. There's a striking formal resonance between the Chalden west wall painting and Byzantine representations of the ladder of John Climacus, iconography that draws from the writings of the abbot of St. Catherine, Mount Sinai, in the first half of the 7th century. John Climacus's text describes a monk's struggles with achieving virtue in the face of vices. The ladder is a metaphor that's used throughout the text. Each rung of the ladder is a step in achieving spiritual perfection. Climacus teaches that a monk must practice abstinence and be an abyss of humility in which every evil spirit has been plunged and smothered. Representations of the ladder appear most frequently in manuscripts and only occasionally in monumental contexts. The best known example of the ladder of John Climacus is on this 12th century tempera painting with gold ground, which is held at the Holy Monastery of St. Catherine's, where Climacus was abbot. The panel is divided diagonally by a ladder, which reaches from the bottom left of the panel to the top right, where Christ is found bust length, with arms outstretched, welcoming the monks to the top. The ladder is formed of precisely 30 steps, as prescribed in Climacus' treatise. Bearded, robed monks climb the ladder as if it were steps, each with their hands raised out. A haloed choir of angels float in the upper left, looking down on the scene. The angels, wearing pinks and blues and greens, contrast with the winged devils shown in shadowy silhouettes, pulling monks headfirst off the ladder with chains to hell. Climacus's ladder is likely derived from Jacob's ladder iconography. I don't want to imply that Byzantine iconography and style hadn't made their way to England by the time the Chalden painting was executed. Recent research by Cecily Hennessy has shown, for example, that a chapel at Winchester Cathedral was painted in the 11th century with knowledge of iconography from Byzantium, perhaps carried from Constantinople by Henry the Lion. Given the contextual differences between the monastic context of the Byzantine images and their textual tradition versus the unusual iconography at Chalden, a rural parish church, it seems unlikely that the visual similarities are much more than a coincidence. But what is most likely is a common point of inspiration. Iconography of Jacob's ladder was influential in both contexts. Perhaps like John Climacus, the designer of the Chalden mural was thinking about Jacob's ladder. Perhaps images as early as this 4th century wall painting from the Via Latina catacomb, or in the case of Chalden, perhaps a much more amenable comparison might be something like this Old English hexateuch depicting Jacob's ladder. However, while there are significant differences between the Chalden painting and Climacus's ladder, Climacus's ladder represents personal steps for individual monks, whereas the Chalden painting is simply a means for its climbers to a changed spatial location going from A to B. The monastic ladder exists in earthly time, helping the monks achieve spiritual perfection in life, while the Chalden ladder helps to remediate a bad situation only in death. Unlike Climacus's ladder, I believe that the ladder in the Chalden painting is a precocious, experimental depiction of purgatory, which uses sources already available in England, as well as iconographic creativity to achieve a new iconography to represent something that hadn't previously needed representing. Even in Paris, a major clerical center for learning and debate, the addition of lateral chapels at the cathedral for the multiplication of altars didn't begin until the late 1220s. So how exactly did ideas about purgatory make it to English villages in the last decades of the 12th century? Can't be certain, but it's likely the pastoralia, manuals written by bishops, archdeacons, and other members of the church hierarchy for parish priests, played a role. According to Le Goff, the true triumph of the doctrine of purgatory was not with clerics, though. It was with the populace, where it scored a tremendous success. The potential of redemption through prayers was exciting to lay people, as it gave them a sense of having some control over their afterlives. It's therefore unsurprising, in the realm of the parish church, evidence of belief in purgatory and a wish for purgation can be seen even from a very early date. Just as the solidification of the doctrine of purgatory changed the imagined landscape of the next world, the spread in beliefs about the afterlife affected life on earth. Unlike hell, as I mentioned earlier, purgatory is not often represented graphically until the later Middle Ages. I found that a search for in the Index of Medieval Art finds only 44 images for the term purgatory, virtually all of them from the 14th century and after, illustrating Dante's Divine Comedy. Just for a quick comparison, the index gives 977 results for hell. As Paul Binsky has noted the problem, or has described the problem, how was purgatory to be distanced usefully from the opposition of heaven and hell, such that its representation as part of the incentive system of medieval images could be plain and unambiguous? While the Chalden solution for representing purgatory didn't seem to catch on more widely, it is in conversation with other visual and textual sources from the Middle Ages. To me, it represents an imaginative, innovative way to reflect the concept of purgatory, answering the call of representing it as a place, but one which is liminal, temporary, and necessitates the forward motion we see here on the ladder. The doctrine of purgatory was formalized in Catholic doctrine rather late in the game, 1274. Yet here it is on the western wall of a rural church in Surrey, the better part of a century earlier. This testimony to the laity's early enthusiasm for purgatorial theology is echoed by Chalden's architecture. The painting is seldom illustrated in such a way that reveals its architectural context. Beyond that, architecture and the graphic arts are often considered independently of one another, yet much can be learned from assessing them in tandem. While tight compositions are often chosen to highlight the iconography of the painting, it's useful to zoom out to see the narrow lancet situated directly above the head of Christ, lighting up the heavenly part of the composition and leaving hell in relative darkness. While the sun rises in the east, the effect in the morning would have been quite brilliant. At Chalden, the painting is located on the western wall of the church, nestled between two aisle responds, and one of them here. The fact that the painting sits comfortably between the two responds without any part of the composition interrupted by the introduction of aisles suggests that it was painted shortly after the addition of the aisles, or once the addition of aisles was planned. The fact that the aisle and painting are contemporary is not a coincidence or an anomaly. I contend that aisles proliferated in parish churches during this era precisely because of a growing belief in purgation, which led to an increased demand for chantry masses. The previous iteration of the church, composed of just nave and chancel, would have been sufficient to meet this new spiritual need of extra masses, which required extra altars. Here, and I apologize for the quality of this photo, we see that a simple piscina for the decorous disposal of sacred ablutions proves that there was an altar here. Chantry masses, held in honor of a dead parishioner, would have been said at this altar. These masses were thought to be the most efficacious form or efficacious way to expiate sin and reduce time spent in the purgatorial fires. An individual could arrange such masses to be held after his or her death in order to hasten the ascent of their soul to heaven. It's because of the growing belief in purgatory, systematically depicted on the west wall, that the aisle finds its place in the architecture of the parish church. In many cases, aisles are introduced to naves in the second half of the 12th century or beginning in the 13th century, and then further expanded in the Middle Ages to increase space and light in the church. For example, at St. Michael on Wyre in Lancashire, we see this narrow lancet window from the first narrow aisle has been filled in to make way for a larger aisle space and larger window in the 16th century. Like Chalden, Crondale in Kent survives with its narrow early aisles, not replaced with a larger aisle in the later Middle Ages like St. Michael on Wyre. Crondale was initially composed of two cells, with an early Norman date indicated by a surviving window high on the north nave wall, whose functionality has been curtailed by the added aisle. In the late Norman period, an aisle was added on the north side. The foundation date for the church is unknown, but it was given to Christ Church Priory, Canterbury around 1150, according to confirmation by Archbishop Theobald of a gift from Eustache and Mistral. It's consistent with the fabric of the church that at least the chancel and nave were standing around 1150 when the church was offered to the monks of Canterbury, but we cannot be sure of whether its north aisle had yet been built by this time. The Crondale north aisle is unusually narrow by the average standard of parish churches. It's less than 2 meters wide, approximately a third of the width of the nave. Not only is it tiny, but its arcade was constructed by excavating the existing wall, rather than knocking out the wall and erecting new columns. This was the simplest way of adding an aisle to a church. Space is gained, but parishioners were spared the endlessly boarded up church during construction, as the exterior aisle wall was probably constructed before anything else was removed. The roofline was not altered in response to the addition of the aisle, so the single gable causes the ceiling to be very low. Unlike Crondale, at Chalden, the decision was made to remove the north and south walls to add an aisle via arcades. This lends more visibility than the Crondale method, but like at Crondale, the aisles are slim. South aisle is just shy of 2 meters and the north is 1.94 meters. Like at Crondale, the Chalden roof gable of the central vessel is extended to cover the aisle. We're fortunate the church remains largely as it was when the painting was executed, because in many places, later medieval wealth and the increased provision of chantry masses and chapels, along with other factors, caused churches to be dramatically enlarged and changed. But at Chalden, we're actually able to at least envision the setting for contemporary users. In our image-driven world, I think it can be easy to forget how images functioned in the Middle Ages. Lay people were meant to attend church at least weekly, plus on numerous other feast days. So even with a very, very conservative estimate, many Chalden villagers saw the West Wall mural at least 52 times a year. Over the course of a lifetime, this could amount to hundreds or even thousands of views. The Chalden mural is on the west wall of the nave, which means that it wasn't viewed during Mass itself, when parishioners would be expected to face the chancel, like we see in this illumination, to face the elevation of the host. Most parishioners would view the mural instead when they turned towards the west to walk out the church through the south door. The location on the west wall means the mural is the last thing seen by parishioners after Mass, as if to punctuate the ritual they had just participated in and witnessed. While Christ's death was reenacted with the consecration of the host on the altar, behind the parishioners, he waited in eternal life as souls reached him in heaven. Might parishioners have reflected upon the scene behind them while looking into the chancel? Perhaps. But I think what's potentially most potent about this image's placement is that it isn't visible to congregants during the duration of the Mass, but becomes visible as they leave the church in a shorter, more intense period, rather than a doom, which could be studiously ignored over the chancel arch while more time-sensitive activities took place below. In the time that I've spent looking at this image, different elements have stood out to me. And when I've shown it to my students, I'm still surprised by the observations they bring to the discussion. This duration of looking, in bursts over several years, seems to me to help understand the medieval viewership of the image. What one notices as a child is likely to be different than to what would draw the same person's eye 20 or 30 years later. A child might be scared by the devils or have hell pointed out by a parent or a preacher during a bout of bad behavior. As a parishioner ages, though, the mural might remind him or her to prepare for the future, a timescale not limited by the mortal lifespan. This could include seeking indulgences, planning for chantry masses, and confessing one's sins. As the parishioner draws closer to death, he or she might actually take solace in the purgatorial ladder and the agency implied by it. The knowledge that the stairway to heaven is a difficult but not impossible climb. Traces of paint were recorded on the north respondent arcade, but these have not survived. Commentators have suggested that this may have been a demon or perhaps Adam. This encourages the possibility that painting stretched around the church and was not limited to only the west wall, a possibility that merits further investigation, but that may yield limited results thanks to the exigencies of iconoclasm, and sometimes worse, restoration. I want to focus on another painted element that does survive at Chalden, which is the Consecration Cross at the bottom of the main west wall composition. Located off-center to the south under the cauldron composition, it's a circle with an internal stylized cross motif created with a compass. There was likely a second cross underneath the bridge of spikes seen, where I've put a second red square. And apparently traces of a third survives on the south arcade. These are only a fraction of the 12 that would have been inscribed on the church at its consecration. The consecration is a ritual wherein the church was anointed with holy oil, first inside, then outside. While evidence for exterior consecration crosses doesn't survive at Chalden, we can see spaces for a number of them here at Uffington, as well as at other churches. By the 12th and 13th centuries, consecrating churches was a solemn duty of the bishops, and we know from complaints that they often shirked this responsibility and needed to be chided for it. Churches often had to wait 2 years or more to be consecrated. According to the Pontifical of David de Burnham, Bishop of St. Andrews, churches were responsible for having 12 crosses painted on the outer walls and 12 on the inner walls, ready to be consecrated by the bishop. A pontifical from Coventry notes the same words of consecration need to be said at each of the 24 crosses, a potentially tedious task that might offer a partial explanation for why bishops were so loath to perform this duty. At Chalden, the surviving cross on the west wall is integrated with the whole composition. This reveals that the same painter or painters who limned the back wall mural painted this, and presumably the 11 other consecration crosses as well. This forges a kind of link between God's time on the back wall and earthly time in the parish, where the consecration ceremony took place in the here and now. In the case of Chalden, the bishop may not have needed help reaching the consecration crosses, but in depictions of the consecration ceremonies, mostly from the 16th century, bishops are shown climbing ladders, like here. It's perhaps a bit of a leap to make, but compelling nonetheless, to imagine the ladder placed between the two crosses on the back wall, so that the bishop could consecrate both of the back wall crosses, his earthly ladder adjoining to the purgatorial ladder depicted on the wall, forging a link between earthly time and the difficult climb to heaven depicted in the painting. The discovery of the Chalden painting was reported in the newspapers, and it was significant enough a draw to inspire a Transport for London poster to be commissioned in 1931. TFL wasn't around in 1131. While we can never know exactly how this mural was planned or how it was received by its viewers when it was first painted on the west wall of the church, we have good evidence to show that the concept of purgatory was an inspiring development for lay people in the 12th and 13th centuries and beyond. And I think it's easy to see why. This is the same historical moment when parishioners are gaining responsibility for the upkeep of the church nave and taking that responsibility with not trepidation, but enthusiasm. Their desires, fears, and concerns were being inscribed upon their churches, and they were developing new strategies for developing community identity. While we can't say for certain who planned or paid for this image, I think we can suggest with some confidence that the agency to travel heavenwards felt more and more in their grasp. While angels provide some assistance and Christ compels the souls towards heaven, we get the impression that from the Chalden mural, that the souls on the ladder are getting to heaven by their own steam, actively climbing rather than awaiting passive judgment. By including this mural on the church wall, the parishioners of Chalden help to locate themselves in both earthly and heavenly time and understand their relationship to the space and time of purgatory. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Meg. That was really, really interesting. I learned a lot. Just as a reminder to people, if you have any questions, it's not too late to pop them in the box. I know we had one about consecration crosses, but I think you actually answered it as the question came in, and that sort of thing. While people can put in other questions, I just have one. And what I really liked is the way that you put the artwork, the painting into its context and sort of zoomed out and looked at where it was in the church. And I was going to ask us a fairly sort of basic question of, do we have any indication of whether there were other wall paintings, in the immediate vicinity? The reason I asked that is that particularly when you showed that sort of 1930s picture, shows there's quite a clear space above where you could have had an additional supporting image or that sort of thing. I mean, I suspect I know the answer, but do we know sort of the broader sort of context of other images that may be interplaying around it?
Yeah, I wish we did. Unfortunately, we don't, not to my knowledge. There are notes of some traces of painting on the arcade and the North Arcade, some traces of the Consecration Cross on the South Arcade, and that probably suggests that there was some more painting. Unfortunately, either that is not able to be found out, or it simply hasn't been yet. It's not impossible to discover more wall paintings now. I mean, the irony, of course, is that reformers, in getting rid of images, actually saved a lot of images, but often finding them is pure luck. I mean, most parish churches would have been, largely painted. In some cases, that wouldn't have been necessarily narrative scenes. It might have been, fictive masonry, that sort of thing, not narrative. And I can't say much more than that about what would have existed at Chalden, although I'd absolutely love to know.
No, I guess that might be the answer, but clearly it was something that probably didn't exist in isolation, but that's fascinating.
I would think so. I would think that it wouldn't exist in isolation.
Yeah, and I particularly liked your point about the end, about the ladder, and then the bishop having to scale a ladder for the consecration as well.
I worry it might be a bit fanciful, but I can't resist. So.
Well, maybe a small step ladder rather than a big one. So Rob, do we have any questions that haven't been answered in the chat?
We do. We've had one here from Robert, not me, different Robert. He said, I believe there is no depiction of purgatory in the Bible. Are you aware of any regional differences in the depiction of purgatory, for example, those found in England, Ireland, or Europe? Or is there a depiction, or is the depiction in each region linked by common features?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, in this time, there's not really a unified way of depicting purgatory. There aren't a lot of surviving depictions of purgatory this early. I mean, you mentioned Ireland. There are some depictions from, I'm guessing, the 13th century of St. Patrick's purgatory, which is sort of a different thing. So that's a sort of a different way of depicting purgatory, as sort of a passage related to particular stories about St. Patrick. And as far as the continent goes, not that I'm able to say. I mean, there are Italian images depicting purgatory that are specifically referencing the literary text, the literary tradition of Dante. So I think that is a sort of different, it's not, I would have to defer to literary scholars on this, but, that's not coming out of theological texts, but coming out of poetry. But yeah, I mean, there is no description of purgatory in the Bible. So it is one of these interesting spaces where the person depicting it needs to come up with a way of doing it. That is an interesting space for, discovering creativity. And then, of course, as iconographies develop, you start to see, can we get what you can kind of imagine is, oh yeah, I saw what they did at that church over there. Can we get something a little bit like that? You start to see, masons and painters and other people traveling around. You probably have, although they don't survive well to us, but things like pattern books and that sort of thing. But in terms of early images or early ways of solidifying a sort of broader iconography, I think this is a place of uncovering some sort of creativity. And I think it's wonderful and fascinating that sort of common objects that would have been, a part of day-to-day lives, ladders and saws and cauldrons and these sorts of things, are finding their way into these images. presumably because those are the objects that, people are familiar with in their day-to-day lives.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I suppose while I was watching it, I had a question as well, which was, I just wondered, as the late medieval period wore on and churches adapted and got different furnishings themselves as well, made by people, screens, partitions, and all these as chantry chapels were installed, and they adapted, as I said. Whether the sort of arrangement took into account what had already been there with the sort of with the position of the painting, and if that was sort of carried across into the arrangement and in the sort of design of the church.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. A lot of the churches that we see today feel a lot barer than they would have felt in the Middle Ages, stripped of screens and that sort of thing. Although in some ways we probably see churches filled with more furniture than people would have. It wasn't until the later Middle Ages that you start to get, larger, more systematic seating in churches. I'm not exactly sure in this case, given the location of it on the back wall, I'm not sure that it would have particularly related much to screens around it. This particular painting, at least, but certainly others did. And I also think it's worth mentioning that in a lot of places, wall paintings, have probably been covered over by later medieval images. I don't really think that wall paintings were meant to be, sort of kept forever. Iconography may have changed later in the Middle Ages, and I don't think they were really, viewed as preciously, as we might from a conservation standpoint. I think in some places where there was money and impetus, there was, people were covering things over with new imagery as well. So, these are spaces that are adapted a lot over time. And you see that in the architecture. You sometimes see that in the furnishing that does survive. And I think you see that in the imagery as well. But how sort of preciously they would hold on to it or, organize things so that old imagery could be still seen, I think it's kind of hard to say.
You completely preempted something I was going to ask you by saying that, because I was going to ask about the permanency of these images and the fact that obviously as art historians and archaeologists or whoever, we see them as fixed in time, but of course, what is the permanency of these things? But I think you gave a very good answer to that one.
Yeah, well, I think it has a lot to do with, with funding. There are some places, that are so famous for their late medieval church, the wool churches and that sort of thing. Cotswold, East Anglia, these places that get really rich in the later Middle Ages. And something like Chalden probably would have been fairly undesirable by that token. So we have to, be grateful for some of these places that didn't have either aggressive patrons or a lot of money in the later Middle Ages.
And also, consequently, when 19th century vicars find a lovely 15th century wall painting, they don't scrub it out to find the 13th century one underneath.
Exactly.
Exactly. Daniela's got her hand up. Has she put a question into the chat box, Rob?
My Wi-Fi is breaking a bit. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, no, we can hear and see you. I can just see that Daniela's got a hand up. So if she's got a question, I can't see one in the chat box. If not, what I'll do, we've got a couple of hands up. One from Wesley as well. What I'll do is just while Rob's connecting his Wi-Fi and just checking the chat box, I'll jump in slightly and do what I was going to do at the end. And was just remind people that we have our annual conference on the 17th of September. It's going to be an online conference, which is open to both members for free, but also non-members for a small fee. And the theme this year, because it's an online conference, we thought we'd take advantage and go for international perspectives on church archaeology. I am not going to read out the whole program now, but we've got papers, a couple of papers on early churches in Israel. We've got papers on burials in Finland and Poland. Scotland makes an appearance, medieval bridge chapels, and then we're even going to go into the new world of New York City and also southern New Zealand. So it's going to be a really, really interesting mix of papers. So do check our website. Members will be being emailed details within the next week or so. I see Rob's just disappeared again on my screen, so I think he's probably not going to rejoin us. So I'm afraid I can't see questions that have popped into the chat box, but we are nearly at our appointed hour, I'm afraid. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank our speaker, Meg Bernstein. That was a fascinating talk. Very, very, very interesting. Just to remind you, next month we have another talk, and it's a double bill this time. We have Nick Webb, I knew I was going to stumble over that one, Nick Webb and Alex Buchanan, who are going to be talking about the vaulted chancel of St Mary's, Nantwich. And again, you'll be able to find details of that via the website and being emailed to members. But thank you very much, Meg, for the fascinating talk. Thank you all for joining us. It's been a pleasure to see you all again, and I really hope that we will see you next month. Until then, good night.
Thank you.